Hi, good evening, everyone. I just want to thank you and to welcome you to the Singapore Art Museum. This is the engine room that you are currently located in within our gallery space. And just to let you know, the galleries will be open only 10 p.m. today. So if you have some time after Imaad's lecture performance, please feel free to also kind of visit our galleries as well. But first, I wanted to welcome you to the lecture performance titled "What is the Sound of a Culture Washing Away?" A lecture performance by Imaad Majeed, who is here with us today. My name is Celine, and I'm Assistant Curator at the Singapore Art Museum. This talk is held in conjunction with the Singapore Art Museum's research efforts titled Village of Rafts, that seeks to chart cultural activity that's been burgeoning across the Indian Ocean littoral. What we've been trying to do at SAM is to try and make sense of approaches that colleagues such as creative practitioners, artists, curators, art historians, and the like that are developing across the rim of the Indian Ocean. And the reason for this is for us to try and reflect on the things that have been part of our critical consciousness without giving it some kind of neater narrative. One tends to forget that individuals or collectives speak from a very specific context. And the aim here for Village of Rafts is to allow for those kinds of contexts to play out and to try and channel this within the public domain, as with you here tonight. My colleague Mustafa, who is here with us, and I began to speak with Imaad some time ago and have come to admire not just the content, but also the methodologies that they have initiated, which is refreshing because it offers an incredible perspective of the contemporary condition. One of the things that really caught our attention was the more collaborative aspects that Imaad had initiated and the spontaneity with which they have worked. We took their methods like music sampling, Spotify playlists, and shitposting as an interesting strategy to think about some of these questions of a kind of creative speculation and content decentralization that stands in its own right in relation to notions of the status quo. We were particularly interested in Imaad's development of a methodology that is, in a way, kind of a refusal of a highly curated presentation that the art world uses. From their independent research into a sonic archive of Sufi music, which you will experience today, to their involvement with the Packet, an artist collective, in developing a self-referential language that essentially turns algorithmic consumption in the digital realm on its head. Today's lecture performance will focus on Imaad's sample-based music-making project, KANNOORU. And we feel that in many ways, Sufism has an incredible history which connects through water and itself maintains a certain fluidity. And one of the most vivid methods of its practice and transmission is through Sufi devotional songs and folk songs. KANNOORU is a long-term project of Imaad's that explores Sri Lankan Sufi Muslim identity, community, memory, erasure, ancestry, and mysticism through these sounds. As part of the lecture performance tonight, Imaad will draw samplings from the archive of Sufi sonics from Sri Lanka of the Muslim community, gathered since 2017. The artists will also share insights gleaned from their readings around Muslim and Sufi communities on the island. Just before I hand the session to Imaad, I want to thank my colleagues Anissa Aidit and the programs team who have supported us in bringing together this event. There will be no Q&A at the end of the session, but you are welcome to approach Imaad directly with questions towards the end. Thank you.
All right. Thank you everyone for making it out tonight. فَلَا أُقَسِّمُ بِالشَّفَقِ وَاللَّيْلِ وَمَا وَسَقَ وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا اتَّسَقَ لَتَرْكَبُنَّ طَبَقًا عَنْ طَبَقٍ. So I do swear by the twilight, and by the night and whatever it envelopes, and by the moon when it waxes full, you shall certainly ascend from stage to stage. The word atasaka is also derived from wasaka, and it means to gather. The gathering of moon signifies that it gathered its light, and it became complete and full, or badr, the moon of the 14th night. The phrase ida tasaka in relation to the moon points to the phenomenon that it goes through various phases. First, it appears as a very fine semicircle, Then its light grows progressively night after night until it becomes 𝘏𝘃𝑚𝑒, the full moon of the 14th night. The word tabak or tabaka refers to a stage. Its plural is tabakat. The word latarkabunna is derived from rukub, which means to mount or mount up. The verse purports to say that mankind, from the inception to the end of their lives, will continue to mount up stage by stage, or will pass through all the conditions, gradually and in stages referred to in the preceding verses. Periods of light and dark and other phenomena. One never remains in one condition all the time. One gradually goes through the vicissitudes of life. On the Sufi path, there are 7 stages or stations known as maqam that we mount stage to stage. Tonight, we are graced by a full moon. We have gathered here to listen to an archive of Sufi and Muslim sonics from Sri Lanka, an island that has passed through many vicissitudes in its history. Through the act of close listening, we will hear the story of a number of communities that have inhabited the island for centuries. Academics such as Denis McGillivray and Victor C. DeMonk have written extensively about Sufi communities in Sri Lanka. McGillivray posited that there were likely migrations from South India of the Tamil Muslim Marakkar community that may have settled along the eastern coast. However, Portuguese colonizers inscribed the identity of 𝘲𝘶 onto the myriad Muslim communities of Sri Lanka, which persists to this day, though many do not have such roots. A Sri Lankan independent scholar, Asif Hussain, has written about Muslims in the East marrying into the Tamil Mukkuvar caste, pointing to the shared matrilocal clan lineage or Kudi names. I belong to my mother's Kudi. 𝘝𝘃𝑗𝑒𝑚. My interest in Sufism began in my adolescence. I would read the Quran in English translation, following every footnote, some of which would include interpretations by the likes of Ibn Arabi and Al-Ghazali. The poetry was readily apparent to me. It is how I learned to close read a text. I would share my interest with an aunt of mine who introduced me to her collection of Sufi texts. There was Rumi and Khayyam, but also Attar. To this day, I count Conference of the Birds among my most treasured books. I picked up my own copy many years later in New Delhi on the same visit that I encountered the Nizamuddin Dargah. Growing up, we were never introduced to Sufism, its music or its texts. We were warned about entering certain mosques because they were shirk, that is, engaged in idolatry. Despite this, our parents would invite fakirs, or mendicants, into our homes to perform ruqya, or exorcisms. As something of a problem child, I was often the cause for these. Still, I never knew that they were Sufi. Later on, as I began my career as a journalist, I started to explore this curiosity. I was fortunate to make the acquaintance of a practicing Sufi from the Gaul Fort community. He took me to a Shazuliya order halara at the Wellowatta Mosque, one that is otherwise very orthodox in its practices. It was such a visceral experience, the chanting, the movements. I attended the Kadakkarapalli flag hoisting ceremony in Kalmone, near our ancestral hometown of Samandure. My mother told me stories of how her maternal grandmother would take her to it. To her, as a child, it was a carnival. Today, a lot of its attendees visit it and engage with its rituals from a distance, though some travel from across the island seeking healing and divine assistance. I interviewed a murshid, or spiritual leader, while I was there. That conversation served as a primer for my understanding of the Sufi path. I befriended a fakir from the Rifai order, Amir Bawa. He invited me to join their ratib, or ritual performance. I sat among the fakirs as they chanted. One by one, fakirs would pick a blade and seek ijazat, or permission, from the murshid and begin a dance that involved poking, stabbing, and slicing motions with the blades against their bodies. By 2017, I had begun collecting CDs of Sufi music from these encounters. I became interested in what the communities themselves deemed worthy of being archived. I began to think of these CDs and the various clips on YouTube as a form of community archival and memory. Yet, outside of the Sufi community, most Muslims in the country would not engage with these. Many in my generation and younger are not even aware that Sufi communities exist on the island, let alone that these practices predate the relationship to spirituality that most have today. There has been an erasure. One of the most influential reformist movements in Sri Lanka is the Tablighi Jamaat. Founded in 1926 in Mewat, India, it spread across South Asia. The monk writes of how their missionaries would visit villages and towns, attend prayers at the mosques, and speak to youth and elders alike about their interpretations of what Muslimness meant. The Tablighi seek to emulate the practices of the companions of the Prophet and see Sufi practices as bid'ah, or invention, and shirk due to the honoring of saints and spiritual leaders. Their influence has shaped how Islam is popularly understood in Sri Lanka today, including the severing of the relationship of music to spirituality. A more recent reformist movement is the National Tawheed Jamaat, founded in the eastern town of Katangudi, that has been a center of Arabization and Wahhabism on the island since the 1980s. Operating between 2016 to 2019, the NTJ became known to the entire island and the world when its founder, Maulvi Zahran Hashim, and his militant group executed the Easter Sunday suicide bombings on April 21, 2019. Since then, Muslim communities across the island have begun reflecting on how such influences had been allowed to fester among them. The Sri Lankan state then turned to Sufi communities as a sort of model minority, constructing the notion of a good Muslim, in contrast to that which the NTJ represented. This has led to many Muslims feeling let down by Sufi communities for going along with this construction. Even in my own ancestral hometown that follows the Tablighi Jamaat, the Tawheed were not allowed to build mosques. Yet during the state's raids, they found a safe house containing weapons and explosives. McGillivray noted in 2019 that although the beginnings of militant opposition to Sufi teachers in the eastern towns of Katangudi and Mardumune can be traced back to the 1980s, the violence there has escalated sharply since 2004, resulting in the destruction and desecration of several saintly tombs and shrines, and forcing one Sufi leader to flee for his safety. The Katangudi headquartered Sufi group All Salon Tariqatul Muflihin has alleged that it was the target of arson by Wahhabi-inspired individuals. Its meditation center was burned to the ground in 2004, and a mob violated the body of the group's founder after his death in 2006. Its founder, MSM Abdullah, alias Pailwan, a prime example of a modern-day Sufi saint, was famous for many things, but among them was his lyricism. He wrote countless songs which were set to music and often played over the loudspeakers of the mosques in Katangudi. We will now listen to one of his songs titled Kale Endra Soleil, Iman Endra Selvam.
கலை என்ற சோலையில் களையாக மாறினான் களை புற்றிருந்த போது தற்கொலை என்ற நிலையிலே சிலையாக இருந்த என் கண்களை திறந்து விட்டாய். தேர்ந்தறிய முடியாத திருநபியின் பொருட்டினால் திசை மாற்றியனை செலுத்தி உன் தீதாறு பெற அருள் செய்த இறையோனே உன்னருளை அனுதினமும் நினைகுவேனே. உன்னானை உனையன்றி ஒன்றுமே இல்லையென எனக்குணர்த்தி பொன்னான வாழ்வழித்தாய். மண்ணான புத்தியை மாய்த்திட்ட மன்னவா மனதார நன்றி அல்லாஹ். பார்வை கேள்வி பேச்சு மூச்சு பார்வை கேள்வி பேச்சு மூச்சு பண்புயாவும் நீயே ஆச்சு பார்வை கேள்வி பேச்சு மூச்சு பண்புயாவும் நீயே ஆச்சு மனித அறிவு மாய்ந்த போதே மல்ஹரென்ற உண்மை கண்டேன் மனித அறிவு மாய்ந்த போதே மல்ஹரென்ற உண்மை கண்டேன் ஈமான் என்ற செல்வமீந்து இருளை நீக்கி ஒளியை தந்த இறைவா உனையே புகழுவேனே இறைவா உனையே புகழுவேனே மாய உள்ள மருட்சி நீங்கி மாய உள்ள மருட்சி நீங்கி கால வெள்ள கரை கடந்தேன் மாய உள்ள மருட்சி நீங்கி கால வெள்ள கரை கடந்தேன் ஆயயாவும் நீயே அல்லால் அணுவும் இல்லை லா இலாஹா ஈமான் என்ற செல்வமீந்து இருளை நீக்கி ஒளியை தந்த இறைவா உனையே புகழுவேனே இறைவா உனையே புகழுவேனே கனவு துன்யா காட்சி நீங்கி கனவு துனியா காட்சி நீங்கி கரிய திரைகள் அகல கண்டேன் கனவு துனியா காட்சி நீங்கி கரிய திரைகள் அகல கண்டேன் மறதி நீங்கி மனிதனானேன் மர்ஹபா சொல்லா இலாஹா ஈமான் என்ற செல்வமீந்து இருளை நீக்கி ஒளியை தந்த இறைவா உனையே புகழுவேனே 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 இறைவா உனையே புகழுவேனே.
The song speaks of weeds transforming into a beautiful garden. The poet speaks of being in a state of contemplating suicide before their eyes are opened, before being guided by Allah's mercy. Listening closely to the instrumentation though, what kind of instruments were you all hearing, and how much of it did you expect to hear? When you guys heard that you're going to hear Sufi music from Sri Lanka, what kind of expectations did you have in terms of the instrumentation itself? You might have caught a saxophone at some point, a brass instrument, which when I first heard this completely threw me off, right? when we listen closely, we can hear distinct influences from South Indian Carnatic music, right? We hear a wind instrument that's possibly a nadaswaram. We hear the strings of a guitar. We then hear what sounds like an oud and a sitar accompanied by a tabla. A veritable fusion of influences, bringing together various sounds into a singular composition. What about the vocal? What does that sound like? Where does it fit in the map in your mind in terms of vocal performances? To me, this seems like a very clear emulation of a South Indian famous Tamil Muslim singer, E.M. Hanifa. So you have what are known as clones of Hanifa across the region. So even in Sri Lanka, you have many singers who devote their entire career to emulating his vocal performance because it's seen as like this pristine ideal. But when you kind of listen to the emotion in how the performance is done, it's kind of like an opari, it's kind of like a lament, right? It's this very deep sense of longing for closeness to Allah or to God that's very like fundamental to the preoccupations of the Sufi, right? The whole point is this closeness. So yeah, that's one song that I thought we'd start with. Right. So next, we're going to listen to a song by a member of the Rifai order. So orders or tariqas are basically kind of like denominations in a sense. So usually an order will be centered around a particular saint, and then over generations and decades and such, you would have different leaders, regional and then the center, etc. In Sri Lanka, there are a number of orders. There's the Rifai, there's the Shazuli, Qadriya, more recently the Naqshbandi, and then a very modern one is the Muflihin. So the song that we just listened to was written by the individual who started the Muflihin order, which is probably the most contemporary or modern order in Sri Lanka. So the Rifai order is interesting because they have, you find the Rifai order in Kerala, for example, and when you look at the rituals that the Rifai conduct in Sri Lanka, it's very similar. There are also Rifai order Sufis in certain African nations as well. Let's try to hear with our ears what kind of differences there might be just musically between them. So this particular song is one that would be sung early in the mornings as the fakirs walk through the villages and towns alike, right? Waking up the faithful in time for Sahur, right? To observe their fast during Ramadan. They would be woken up by this song. This practice has long since been abandoned in most areas because of the influence of the Tabligh. But there are a few localities, even certain parts of Colombo, where it still happens. North Colombo, which most people ignore and pretend isn't part of Colombo. But yeah, let's listen to what it sounded like to wake up during Ramadan.
Sahar, Sahar, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah, La ilaha illallah. யாரிபாயி வாருங்கள் பாரில் நாங்கள் பலம் பெறவே பாதிசாவே வாருங்கள் லா இலாஹ இல்லல்லாஹு லா இலாஹ இல்லல்லாஹ் லா இலாஹ இல்லல்லாஹ் முஹம்மதுர் ரசூலுல்லாஹ் ஆலநதியின் வழிதன்னில் அன்பியா கூலம் தன்னில் பாலராக பாரில் பிறந்த பாவ குருவே வாருங்கள் லா இலாஹ இல்லல்லாஹு லா இலாஹ இல்லல்லாஹ் லா இலாஹ இல்லல்லாஹ் முஹம்மதுர் ரசூலுல்லாஹ் தாக நதியின் வழியில் வந்த தத்துவ வலி உள்ளார் தாகம் தீர்த்து காத்தாருள தௌலத் சேக வாருங்கள் லா இலாஹ இல்லல்லாஹு லா இலாஹ இல்லல்லாஹ் லா இலாஹ இல்லல்லாஹ் முஹம்மதுர் ரசூலுல்லாஹ் அகமது காதிரி என்று அருமையுடனே அழைக்கின்றோம் 𝘍𝘧𝘵𝗔𝗐 குறைகள் நீக்கி செழுமை தரவே வாருங்கள் லா இலாஹ இல்லல்லாஹு லா இலாஹ இல்லல்லாஹ் லா இலாஹ இல்லல்லாஹ் முஹம்மதுர் ரசூலுல்லாஹ் பாவஜான் சகர் சகர் பாவஜான் go go
So the differences are quite stark, right? But this is coming from the same region, like down to even the province, right? This is eastern Sri Lanka. So the Muflihin comes out of Katangudi, and yet it's sort of connected to this more regional sound of the Carnatic and all these influences. But here, the instrumentation is so bare, right? What we are hearing is just a tambourine that you see him holding, which has these zills or little cymbal-like things. The rhythm in most of the Rifai orders music is often in the time signature 6/8, which is very common in Sri Lanka in other genres such as baila, but also what colloquially or elitists in Sri Lanka call bus music, which is actually the most popular form of music in Sri Lanka, but it doesn't play on the radio as much. So this rhythm, you also hear it in a lot of Buddhist and Hindu rituals as well. And there's something about it that feels very feels like the rhythm of the island in a sense to me, at least in certain parts. The vocal performance here, would you say there were similarities? Was he also trying to emulate Hanifa? Did he have something distinct about it? Was it still the mode of lament? When you listen to the rhythm, did it seem more celebratory in a sense? Especially the flourishes towards the end with the drum, like he's really trying to like wake you up and stir you up and kind of activate you. And that's what's interesting about the Rifai Ratib as well. When the performance happens, all the fakirs are sitting around and playing the daf and singing, and as it becomes more and more intense, the dancers as well with the blades become more activated as well. And it's a sort of approach of fana that they're seeking through this sort of trance-like activity. Yeah, so, sorry. This next example comes from the Naqshbandi order, right? So the Naqshbandi order comes out of Turkey, and in recent years it has been introduced into Sri Lanka, but particularly Colombo. So it's the more sort of cosmopolitan, elite, kind of refined, if you want to use that term, order. You couldn't really consider it folk or popular as such, very niche. They were able to produce an album, like go to a studio, afford this kind of archival as such. So this CD is not one I collected. I found it in my house while going through the things that my father had collected. So some of the songs on this album are a bit strange. They sound very new agey. So they have new age in the sense of like what happens when white people discover Eastern spirituality, those vibes. So in certain songs you'll hear like the guitar used in a very conventional way and melodies that would be appreciated by a Western ear. But tonight we're not going to listen to those. Instead, I'm choosing one that's got more of the stronger Turkish influence and more emblematic of the Sufi order itself, where they just employ a chorus of voices and a drum. Salatullah, salamullah.
Yeah.
I think what's immediately apparent is just the quality of the recording, which they could afford, which also makes this amazing to sample from, like especially that right at the end, that bit with just the drum. I'll show you that later. So yeah, the drums here and so the rhythm and the melodies are drawing from Turkish ika, which is a way of referring to rhythms, and makam, which are scales. And they're actually only subtly different to their Arab counterparts. The whole study of Arab music and its influence in itself is like really fascinating because it poses so many challenges to ethnomusicology, because it's a system where the music theory as such was never really formally written down. It was always passed on orally, right? So there have been many attempts to try to like understand it as a system, but really something I found helpful was to think of it as like dialects. So in different, like whether it's Egypt or like these different countries, they'll have a melodic scale, for example, like we think of the C major scale or whatever it is. There'll be subtle differences of like microtones. So let's say B flat is slightly flatter in one region and slightly sharper in another, but those are very important distinctions to them, like the pronunciation of words, right? So here, when we listen to the performance compared to the others, does the performance in itself feel different to you? The mood of the song, right? This is very uplifting here. The tonality, the kind of relationship of the vocals themselves with the rhythm. There's something very immediately uplifting that you're hearing. But there's also a certain fixity to the way the rhythm is performed. It's so exact. They're going right on to tempo and right into the grid. And the vocals seem very disciplined as well. It's not like the other performances where there's the lilting and like these melisma and these other qualities, right? They're approaching like this very pure sound in that vocal. So yeah, in a sense, there are ways that you can hear in the music itself differences in the cultures and the people as well. Or in terms of like what an ideal is, or what to them this kind of spirituality sounds like. But one of the troubling findings in my exploration of the archive as is has been the absence of recordings of women's voices. 𝗫𝘔𝘐𝑒𝑚 has written about women and devotional music in Sri Lanka in a recent text published by the ICES. She cites a conversation with Larina Huck, who spoke of traditions in the East, especially in Akkarapattu and Irakkamam, noting that women's religious practices involving song have been affected by what she terms purist movements. So here she's not even using the word reformist, but purist, right? She says, so there's Larina Huck saying, around 20 years ago, before Wahhabism, the women used to put up awnings, spread white cloth beneath, and sing the Talai Fatiha and Maulid on holy days such as Ashura and Milad. Wahhabism stopped women's freedom, and there is no outlet for women to release their worries and stress. Women belonging to tariqa groups also gather to sing religious songs at ziyarat to palli, or shrines of worship, which provide them the space to do so. So what she's laying out here is a sort of the function of these spaces, of this music, of these rituals, and the gendered aspect to it, right? So the influence of the purist and reformist movements is not just that the music isn't as widely heard, but the women are not heard. They're not hearing themselves performing this music. They're not being heard by others performing this. There is no outlet, as she's saying, for the cathartic effects of participating in this music, right? She goes on to say, the women of the older generation in the East and women in parts of the country where the influence of purist groups is weak, these practices still continue. And actually right now, one of my friends who I mentioned earlier from the south of the island is actively trying to make recordings of women in those areas participating in Mawlid and things like that. But there's definitely a need to fill this vacuum in the archive. Only then will I start to sample from it. My practice is to not do any actual recording because I want to see what people have already felt like recording. So I want to represent the archive as it already exists. So where I have found recordings of women's voices is in the documentation of folk music of the Muslim communities of Sri Lanka. My grand-aunt, 𝘍𝘲𝘬𝘗, commissioned a compilation that sought to preserve these traditions, as it is not as common to hear these songs these days. These songs were painstakingly compiled by S.H.M. Jamil. We will now listen to a song that functions as a lullaby. My own paternal grandmother used to sing this to her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren.
தென் இலங்கையில் வழக்கில் இருந்து வரும் அவ்வாறான சாய்ந்தாடு பாவா பாடலொன்று இதோ. பாடுபவர் ஜெசீனா காசிம்.
சாய்ந்தாடு பாவா சாய்ந்தாடு அண்ணல் முஹம்மது முன்னாலே, சாய்ந்தாடு பாவா சாய்ந்தாடு அழகு நிலாவே சாய்ந்தாடு, சாய்ந்தாடு பாவா சாய்ந்தாடு சாயக்கிளியே சாய்ந்தாடு, சாய்ந்தாடு பாவா சாய்ந்தாடு மயிலே குயிலே சாய்ந்தாடு, சாய்ந்தாடு பாவா சாய்ந்தாடு வட்டினுள் சோற்றுக்கு சாய்ந்தாடு, சாய்ந்தாடு பாவா சாய்ந்தாடு வாழைப்பழத்துக்கு சாய்ந்தாடு, சாய்ந்தாடு பாவா சாய்ந்தாடு கிளிப்பிள்ளை சோத்துக்கு சாய்ந்தாடு, சாய்ந்தாடு பாவா சாய்ந்தாடு கோர்த்த முத்தே சாய்ந்தாடு, சாய்ந்தாடு பாவா சாய்ந்தாடு ஆட்டுக்கும் சோற்றுக்கும் சாய்ந்தாடு, சாய்ந்தாடு பாவா சாய்ந்தாடு அமுத குரலே சாய்ந்தாடு, சாய்ந்தாடு பாவா சாய்ந்தாடு அழகு மயிலே சாய்ந்தாடு, சாய்ந்தாடு பாவா சாய்ந்தாடு மாடப்புறாவே சாய்ந்தாடு.
So here, the refrain, Saindadu Bava Saindadu, refers to a rocking motion of a child, which in the song is performed in front of Prophet Muhammad himself. As the refrain repeats, she describes the moonlight, the birds, and the beauty of nature. But the song also expounds to the child the virtues of a good Muslim and the importance of the teachings of Islam. The next song we will listen to also functions as a lullaby, yet here it is sung by a father, extolling the virtues of the Creator while putting the child to sleep.
தென்னிலங்கையைச் சேர்ந்த இதை பாடுபவர் நசீர் ஆகும்.
அவனே அல்லால் வேறாரோ, சீரா உலகம் படைத்தோனின் சிறப்பாமல்லா என் நாமம், நேராய் கல்வில் வைத்தே நினைவாய் நினைவாய் உறங்கு என் மகளே, ஆறாரவர் யாரை புகழ்ந்தாலும் எல்லாம் அல்லா தனக்காகும். நேராய் தீனை தந்தோனை நித்தம் புகழ்வாய் என் மகளே. சொல்வாய் நபி மேல் தலவாத்தை செல்வம் பெருகி முடதீரும். எல்லாம் அவர்கள் ஒளிவாலே அல்லாஹ் படைத்தான் எம் மகளே. ஆராரோ ஆரேராரோ தோங்கும் தொட்டினில் ராமான் தன்னை நித்தம் மறவாமல் பாங்காய் கவியை கேட்டறிந்து பலனி பெறுவாய் என் மகளே. ஈமான் உடனே கலிமாவை ஓதித் தொழுது முதலீந்து சீமான் தனக்காய் நோன்பு வைத்து அச்சோ செய்வாய் என் மகளே. ஏவல் எடுத்து விலகலை வீழ்த்தி அஞ்சி பயந்தே தௌபாச்சை பாவம் நம்மை ரஹ்மான் பதலாக்குவான் என் மகளே. பொய்யும் புறமும் கொள்கது பொறாமை பெருமை முகத்தாழ்ச்சி கையும் தமக்காய் நீதாவிருந்து கல்வை களவோ என் மகளே. சிறப்பாம் பாவம் அடங்கலுக்கும் துன்யா தன்னை உகப்பதென அரசர் முஹம்மது ரசூல் மொழிந்தார் காரணம் என் மகளே. ஆராரோ ஆரேராரோ ஊரில் பொருளும் பட்சணமும் எல்லாம் உனக்கே கிடைத்தாலும் நீரின் குமிழி போலாளியும் நிலைக்கும் நல்ல அமல் மகளே. துன்யா வாழ்க்கை கனவை போல் துன்பமுடனே அதுதானும் மனத்தால் வருத்தால் அழியாத வாழ்வை பெறுவாய் என் மகளே. கொஞ்ச நாளில் துன்யாவில் களைப்பார அமலை நீ செய்தால் பஞ்சவர்ண தொட்டிலின் மேல் பௌசாய் ஆடுவாய் என் மகளே. இருமை நீக்கி தௌஹீதின் அருமை மஹ்ரிபா கோடிப்பை பெரியோன் புகட்டுவான் ஆமீன் கௌதுல் அலம் பொருட்டாலே. ஆராரோ ஆரேராரோ ஆராரோ ஆரேராரோ.
So here he's saying, the father, the straight path has been shown. Let's follow it, my daughter. He also goes on to speak of the myriad vices of human beings, such as jealousy, pride, hypocrisy, and the need to be vigilant of them. He asks her to perform tawbah or repentance, which is the first maqam or station or stage in the Sufi path. The last song we will listen to speaks of a young man reciting the Quran under the light of an oil lamp.
நித்திர கண்ணிலையும் நினைவிலையும் தானேராதே களிமா வீரலும் மஜண்ட கல்வதித்த மோதிரமும் மாசம் 14 வளவு நிறைந்த நீலா சிற்றொழுங்கை கொள்ளால 2 செருப்பழுதே போகுதுகா மச்சானே இன்பம் மணக்கின்ற சீராவே உச்சால சாய வப்பா குருகாமம் போகின்றார் ஓதி படித்து ஊர்வல வாழ்ந்தாலும் சோலைக்கு செய்த தீங்கை அல்லாஹ் எள்ளளவும் ஏற்க மாட்டான் விளக்கரிய குமரன் குர்ஆனோதே தந்தாண்டவனே.
So it says, as much as you might study, pray, and achieve in life, if you have wronged the poor, even a wrong as small as a sesame seed, then God will not accept all the good that you have done. So in these folk songs, not all of them have Islamic references, but I picked those for tonight. But what we're left with is the question that is the title of this talk. What is the sound of a culture washing away? Which is really the only way for me to kind of explore that with you is to take you through a bit of the process of how I approach sampling these archives. This really began because I felt quite, how to say, at odds with a lot of the genres of music that I was exploring before, amidst questions of cultural appropriation. I wondered, should I be rapping? Should I be doing this? Like, what is my claim to this culture? And then I thought, oh, what about music in my thing? And yeah, then began this process. So what I've loaded up here is a free and open source program. It's readily accessible, very easy to use. What we're looking at is the waveform of the song 𝘨𝘬𝘗𝙗. And what I'm going to do now is just isolate this little bit here. So,
சாய்ந்தாடு பாபா சாய்ந்தாடு.
right? And what I'm going to do is, so if you think of folk music, right, it's passed on orally. It goes generation to generation. And in a way, it's as though this vocal is going to stretch over a long period of time. So let's literally stretch it. Let's stretch it by a factor of 7.86. Oh, it won't let me do 0.86. And then hear what it sounds like. Suddenly has a very different effect. But let's repeat that. Stretch it further. Now let's hear what it sounds like. Maybe close your eyes for this. It's almost hypnotic, right? So now I'm going to show you when I created my demos what those projects look like. So using this same method, so this is what a project file looked like. So here there are these vocal stretches that are sort of brought in, and bits of drums added in as well. So the beat is just, if you listen to just the beat, it's me finding a bit of a recording that has just that beat and then repeating it. But let's move on from this period to what my approach is like now. So can do a little bit of a performance for you all. Please note that this is the first time that I'm doing this in front of a live audience. So just trying out a format. So I told you all before that the Naqshbandi recording was very easy to use, right? So this, what you're seeing here is that very tail end of the drum. So it'll go. So now this is very easy for me to play with. What I then do is I create what's called a drum rack. So what you're seeing down here, on the left side, I have the Naqshbandi. And on the right side, I have the Rifai, which is closer to where I'm from. So what I'm also able to do is isolate the 𝘍𝘳 to get that quality of the tambourine. But what I do is I try to listen to the various types of beats or rhythms in the archive and learn how to play them as well. So what I've done, in the interest of saving time, is I've prepared some of them already, and we're just going to sort of work through them. Let's start with this one.
Muhammad
exploration. Yeah. So then, let's try bringing the tempo down a bit and try a different rhythm. So here actually, the rhythm isn't where I started. What I started with was listening to this particular segment of the song about the young man and the Quran.
ஓதி படித்தே ஓர்மகள வாழ்ந்தாலும் தொலைக்கு செய்தீங்கை அல்லாஹ் எல்லளவும் ஏற்க மாட்டான் ஓதி.
Right? So that's the specific line where she's talking about if you wrong the poor, nothing will be accepted. So I listened to it and tried to draw the melody from it. And I don't have it with me here, but I use an analog synthesizer and I've crafted, dialed in a specific tone to kind of evoke the harmonium, which is often used, especially in India. So attempting to get that melody, I got this. And then trying to play it to that.
Allah
So there's an example where I'm sampling from melody and trying to carry that through. Yeah, so this next one is less interested in emulating pre-existing rhythms from the archive, but bringing it to a more modern sensibility or contemporary styling. Because the goal of this project is not necessarily trying to rekindle the memories of the generation who allowed for this thing to disappear. My interest is in people my generation and those younger. So I want them to hear something that they can relate to. So it can't sound too old in that it's almost foreign, but bring it somewhere closer. And my hope is that that will inspire a younger generation to explore it, to listen to it, maybe inspire an ethnomusicologist from the Muslim community, because we really need that. So here's a rhythm. Back to the Muflihin, Katanguri, Halwan. We heard that Nadaswaram, right? What happens when we just use that? So if I just try to play that out, it's like... that went better than I expected. So I'm going to show you one last thing, and it is very quickly pull this up. Right. So this is a kind of visual mood board I made about 9 months ago when I was still using Audacity, the other program. So this is very much like a collage, right? Cutting and chopping little pieces, arranging it, no grid, no looping function, just really like a visual artist kind of approach. And this is a mood board I made mostly to hype myself up and feel, engaged. So what I did here is taking the same approach of archive as is, but for visuals. So this entire video is found images of people from 𝘗𝘪𝘴𝘗𝘗, which is where my grandaunt 𝗍𝘗𝘬𝘳 is from, how they've documented their own town. And then it's, you have an interplay of news images and how the Muslim community has been portrayed in different ways. And you're hearing 2 songs. For one, the sample you heard earlier today, so that will sound familiar. This is a demo for Tauba and Wara. Tauba, again, is the first station. Wara is the second station. And I will leave you with this. Yeah. Yeah, thank you everyone for making it out tonight, for sticking through to the end. Thank you to Singapore Art Museum for inviting me and this project over. It's been quite the experience figuring out how to contextualize this and kind of tell a story for you all. And yeah, thank you, Shabir, Celine, Anissa, everyone who's helped me so far. And yeah, I hope you learned something, have things to reflect on. Hope you'll tell people about this. And there's actually a documentary now on music from the Muslim community of Sri Lanka. If you Google it, you should be able to find it. It's called Minarets. And this project in a very early stage is featured in that too. So hopefully this is something we'll hear more of in the future. Thank you.